Well, welcome to the Equipped for Life podcast. We are back with three of my favorite pro-lifers in the entire universe. We have Emily Albright, we have Andrew Kaake, we have my good friend Monica Snyder from Secular Pro-Life. If you haven't heard part one, stop. We have a whole bunch of setup in part one that we're just not going to repeat here. We're just going to assume that you've heard that. This is a continuation of that podcast just because we don't want to do 2.5 hour long podcasts.
We have a lot of thoughts.
We have a lot of
so
thoughts.
many thoughts.
We've had a lot of experiences dealing with difficult pro-lifers. What can I say? So let's jump in. We want to talk about the other four types. We've already talked about the first four. We talked about the biblical pro-lifers. They won't stop quoting the Bible. It is their only argument against abortion. We've talked about the misogynistic pro-lifers. These are the women need to keep their legs closed type people that just need to be called out when they show up. We've talked about the pro-lifers that are dismissive and just kind of reducing the effects of pregnancy as this pregnancy is a super fine thing, except maybe the last 2 months. It's like, it's not a big deal. Who would want to have an abortion? Like, it's crazy. And then we've talked about the Christian apologist. He shows up a lot with secular pro-life, constantly trying to convert them to Christianity instead of reacting to their pro-life thoughts or welcoming the diversity that secular pro-life brings to the pro-life movement. Now let's talk about, and there's kind of multiple pro-lifers in this, but this is like you're not pro-life enough. The gatekeepers of the pro-life movement. We've definitely had some experiences with that. Emily, tell us about this type.
Yeah, so these type of pro-life people tend to have an attitude that there is, in their mind at least, some sort of quote-unquote perfect pro-lifer out there. There is a pro-lifer that
it's probably looks like them.
Right, looks like them, exactly. There's a pro-lifer that fits their agenda perfectly. And if you are not that pro-lifer, if you differ from them in some way, then you should probably just be doing nothing.
Yep.
Like you have to meet a certain threshold of acceptability in order for you to be doing anything in the pro-life movement that they would deem worthwhile, or they don't really want you involved if you're not fitting their criteria.
You're a fly in the pro-life ointment right now. Right. You really need to deal with that if you're going to be part of our team. Yeah.
Interestingly enough, we've seen this happen in a couple different kinds of pro-lifers can fall into this category, and pro-lifers who would probably disagree vehemently about a lot of things. So on one end of the spectrum, we have the abolitionists,
right.
AHA, abolish human abortion type,
right.
who often have an attitude of, you're not going far enough, fast enough. You're not doing enough. And if you're not going to the absolute ultimate extreme of what we think the pro-life movement could be doing right now, like, you're not really pro-life, and you're being complicit in abortion.
Yeah.
And so if you're not fitting our particular agenda, you shouldn't be doing this.
There's also often you're not using the Bible enough.
Right.
You're using too much secular stuff. And we're not going to get into the weeds on AHA. We have 2 podcasts about AHA. If you want to know all about the history of AHA and some of the problems with the things that they do, we'll link to those 2 podcasts in the description. What are some other types of people that do this?
Sure. So there's kind of on the other end of the spectrum of pro-life people you can imagine, we have the consistent life ethic people. So people who have, a list of 10 or 13 different issues that they're really, really passionate about. And being pro-life is one of them. And there's also all these other things, like they're very pro-immigration and they're pro-LGBTQ plus rights and pro-trans rights and pro all sorts of other things. And sometimes those people can have an attitude that if you are pro-life, but you're not also fighting for the other 10 things in this list, then you're not pro-life enough and you shouldn't be doing what you're doing either. And I have a feeling that the AHA type people and the consistent life ethic people don't agree about just about anything. Like they don't have a lot in common.
I would pay to watch 3 of them and 3 of them in a room
right.
and have to talk to each other, but I don't think it would go very well.
But the thing is, they both engage in the same kind of thing of if pro-life people don't fit on their particular agenda, then maybe the pro-life work that you're doing isn't worth doing and you shouldn't be doing it. And I think that is highly problematic.
Yeah. And again, not all CLE people do this, but
yes,
some
obviously
people
not.
Do. Have either of you had experiences of this?
Oh, yeah, on both sides. But I just want to say real quick, I don't think they're saying if you don't do it my way, you shouldn't bother. I think they're just hoping to motivate you to do it their way in addition.
Yeah, I think a lot of those exist, yeah.
All the time on both sides. We have the abolitionist types that are usually, they think that we're weakening the pro-life movement because we're secular. And so we're taking away the core reason to care about any of this. And it's not just that they don't like the way we're doing it. They think we're harming the movement. So we get that a little bit. And sometimes we don't get the consistent life as much because people always think we're a consistent life group. We're not. We're a single issue group, but we work with consistent life groups a lot. And so by association, they assume that we are. And the people who lead our group do tend to be pretty consistent life, not on every single thing, but we just sort of blend in there and they just think that we are. But sometimes people will come in and say, you never talk about this, you never talk about that. Especially, we just didn't talk about Trump last election, one way or the other. We just stopped talking about Trump and people got mad about that on both sides. Both sides got mad at us about that.
Wow.
So we just continue to go that middle road. But I generally just, honestly, I ignore them entirely. Like, if you don't think I'm pro-life enough, that's not going to change what I'm doing. And I don't need you to think I'm pro-life enough. There's nothing you have that I need you to approve of me. So, okay, I'm just going to keep going anyway.
I was just going to say, I feel like we're being a little too nice to the abolitionists in particular here. Just because it's not even that I'm surprised they're not happy that you're weakening the pro-life movement, since they, think the pro-life movement is like supporting abortion, literally.
Right.
But like one of the reasons these people, and I get more CLE people other than when I wrote the article on the abolitionists and their little SBC coup last year. So a lot of what I do is appeal to people to be intellectually consistent and to be intellectually honest. And so this purity test thing gets used as a cudgel to be like, oh, well, you're not really as consistent as you say you are, because you don't believe this, this, and this. And I'm just like, well, it doesn't logically follow. I'm being pretty consistent. I don't have to oppose the death penalty to think that an innocent fetus should not be killed. Like, it's not really on the table, and it's a distraction from this other thing. But like, because of the way that it operates in conjunction with our approach at ERI, I really find the purity test people annoying. Like they sometimes it's just that they get under my skin, and sometimes it's because some of our worst commenters are these people. Our worst commenters on the pro-life side are the ones who are trying to purity test us and accuse us of hypocrisy at the same time.
And it's really unfortunate because I feel like most of the work is trying to get people more involved in pro-life work. Most people don't do anything about this issue one way or the other.
Right.
And the easiest way I think to get them involved is to show them they can just take little steps to start to be involved. Just small things. But the you're not pro-life enough if you don't do all these different things, people, they're sending the opposite message. They're sending like, you may as well not even, if you can't do these many different things or these intimidating things or these aggressive things or these unpopular things all at once, don't bother. And they're, I think, weakening our resources because there are people who aren't comfortable with everything, but they might be comfortable with something.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
I think you just also mentioned another factor of the purity test person, which is they often say the reason you're not willing to do all of these things is just because you're trying to be popular.
Yeah.
Which I find absolutely hilarious.
If I was trying to be popular, I wouldn't be here at all.
Do you think that I'm popular doing pro-life work full time? That is my life.
Especially as an atheist. Like, we get so much flack. There's no way. Point. It's just absolutely ridiculous. We have pro-life atheist activists who've basically torpedoed their in real life social lives once they came out as pro-life. And then people are like, oh, you don't want to take this position because you don't want people to yell at you. People yell at me all the time. Okay. Like, that's part of the job.
Yeah, there's I've got family members, extended family members and friends that as soon as they find out what I'm doing, they're not as interested in talking to me about my work at all. I mean, like you and I were both on track to be professional musicians.
Yes.
Instead of doing pro-life work. And we both chose pro-life work instead. There is definitely a part of me that often misses the experiences that I'm not having on a stage, playing amazing music with other amazing musicians.
I was working in a private forensics lab. I loved that job. And that job was the opposite of this, where when you tell people you're working in a forensics lab, even if you're doing a relatively minimal position, they're immediately impressed. Yeah. There's like so much social cred to that. And I switch to this. I think about that all the time.
You become the pariah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's like certainly there are certain like rare contexts where we can feel popular. Like the Students for Life conference is always kind of fun because a bunch of those students are already familiar with us, and so they come to the booth. It's like, hey, just from, and they're doing selfies and all that, and like that's super fun and lovely, and I want to give those people a really good experience. But that's not most of my life. Most of our life, we're dealing with the people that are making us sometimes not want so much to be in the pro-life movement because they're making our life so hard. I mean, I got all the times I've like, man, do I want to stay in this movement? It's because of pro-lifers, not pro-choice people. I can handle the pro-choice people. It is the difficult pro-lifers or difficult, leaders of pro-life groups even sometimes that, and I'm not going to name any names, but like that, those are the times it's like, it's getting really tempting to maybe go and just like do something else. And you guys can just have this, you can just,
You have kept the gate very well. I'm leaving.
Right. I'm out. Okay, let's talk about, oh my gosh, this is such an important one to talk about, especially this year. Okay, the pro-lifers that constantly strawman bodily autonomy arguments.
I see it on our social media every single day.
Every day.
We just talked about the fact that we got a TikTok, right? We are now on TikTok. Please go follow us on TikTok. And that means that a few minutes of my day every day, I am scrolling through the pro-life TikTok space, which is pretty tiny, and seeing what other kinds of pro-life content people are putting out on TikTok.
Yeah.
And 90% of it is people strawmanning bodily autonomy. I cannot tell you how many videos I have watched of very well-meaning pro-life people that are about my age being like, I want to make a difference on pro-life TikTok. And I'm like, yes, please be doing that. But you've got to do it better than this, because making a video of yourself saying it is not your body, therefore it is not your choice. Done. Mic drop. So not helpful.
Yeah.
Like,
But Emily, don't you know that women don't have 4 hands, 4 feet?
It's painful because I've used that argument before a long time ago. Like I used to have one of my cool stories I used to tell people was when I not really debated. I was at a fair booth, but I had a back and forth dialogue with, he was running as a Democrat for either Senate or House or something like that. But like we had a little dialogue about abortion. And my mic drop moment at the end was oh my gosh, I can't believe it was the 4 eyes, 2 noses, 20 fingers thing, because that's what I had been taught to say in response to, but as part of her body. And I didn't realize that is not what hardly any pro-choice person actually means. They don't literally think it's like an organ. There are some.
Yeah, really, this is where our experiences differ again.
Yeah.
I think.
Okay. So I want you to jump in and talk about it, because we've had this conversation many times before. And that's part of why I invited you on. But for me, most of the pro-choice people that I talk to, because I will ask them the clarification question when you say it's a part of her body or whatever. Do you mean X, Y, or Z? And almost none of them are making not a bodily autonomy argument. They're not saying it's not a person because it's dependent, and they're not saying that it's literally a part of her body like a kidney. They're saying because of a woman's bodily autonomy, there would be a government overreach to say that women cannot do this thing with their body or something in their body or something that is that connected to their body, like something like that. There's multiple versions of bodily rights arguments. We got a whole landing page that Monica made me make, by the way. The landing page, the bodily rights landing page that we have.
I use that a lot, by the way.
Monica was like, please make me a landing page of all your bodily rights stuff. I will link to it all the time. So I was like, okay, I will do that.
We link to it on our landing page. We have a section about bodily rights, and we're like, here's equal rights part. Just go look at their stuff.
I love secular pro-life. So we will link to that.
Thank you, Monica.
Yeah. I do agree with you. I basically mostly agree with you on all of it. The only difference is, even in our circles, it's pretty rare that they mean it literally as a body part, but sometimes they do. We talk about biology a lot, and so it's probably selection bias that people were bringing into the fore. But especially on Twitter, we do have people that try to argue literally that it's not a separate entity. They're still the minority, for sure. But I think that when you throw them into the mix, I get that pro-lifers are straw manning, but I sympathize with them because it's kind of a complex topic, and sometimes they're actually not. Usually they are, though. But depending on who they're responding to, they might not be. So
yeah,
I pretty much, it's a minority case, but there are definitely people out there that are saying it literally, like comparing it to. We have a lot of debates about what constitutes an organism versus an organ versus whatever, and there's a lot of miseducation about it. So maybe some of them are responding to that.
I think it's more understandable for people to be confused about the definition of an organism than it's literally a part of her body. Like I know, like when I think, at least in my experience, and you know, everyone jump in if you have a different experience, but like for me, when I have had dialogues with pro-choice people about the biological side of this debate, the portion of the debate that relates to science and biology, it's usually them just confused about organism, and they think that skin cells or sperm cells or whatever are also, they have living human DNA too. So aren't they persons too? And they just don't understand what I'm talking about yet. And I have to clarify or explain what an organism is. And like, fine. And it doesn't usually take that long, and we usually move into another thing. So definitely part of this is also just that selection bias thing, where if a lot of my dialogues were on college campuses where people are just on generally making better arguments, Philosophy 101, most students were being taught like the violinist argument and stuff like that. So we're hearing typically pretty good pro-choice arguments, and a lot of the worst ones are just sort of getting filtered out. Whereas Monica's been talking to a lot of people online.
Yes, and I imagine the people you're seeing on TikTok are also probably talking to a lot of people online. And so you guys have a kind of work where you filter for a very specific echelon of pro-choice arguments. Yeah. And I don't think it represents what most, like the average pro-choice American is saying most of the time. I think it's very important because you need to be able to address the best pro-choice arguments. But I sympathize with the people where they're not experiencing that. That's not what they're experiencing, especially on Twitter or wherever.
Yeah.
Right. And I think a lot of times pro-choice people can be very unclear with the words that they choose, especially online. I think that most of the pro-choice people who are saying really weird things in my TikTok comments that like come off really stupid, I'm like, I don't think if I actually could sit down and have a conversation with you that that's what you mean. I really do think you're making a bodily autonomy argument. The problem is you don't know how to articulate that.
You're helping
you've never
them
thought
do it
about
better.
that much. Right, exactly. And so they're going to say a thing that sounds awfully like they're confused about the biology. And so I understand why a pro-life person is going to be like, yeah, well, they're just confused about the biology.
Right.
And so the problem is I've talked to enough pro-choice people that I know that's probably not what they actually mean.
Yeah.
But I understand that it sounds like that's what they mean because a lot of pro-choice people who maybe haven't been through Philosophy 101 are going to say things that sound really stupid.
Right.
Well,
and
you just don't have the
kinda
vernacular.
Right. They don't have the vernacular to talk about it. And so they're going to say things that come across like they mean not what I think they actually mean if you were to ask them questions and find out.
So a couple of key points for pro-lifers to remember, even those of you that don't feel like you're very philosophical, that's totally fine. Understand pro-choice people are often super vague with their rhetoric, or they're using shorthand because they're on Twitter or whatever. And so if you think you know what they're saying, you very well might not. Ask more clarification questions. And if they're saying something that sounds super stupid, there's extra likelihood that you don't understand them yet. I know there are people making stupid pro-choice arguments, just like there are people making stupid pro-life arguments. I'm not saying that never happens. You can ask a bunch of clarification questions and be like, oh yeah, your argument is actually that bad. I've had that experience. I'm just saying a lot of the time, in 3 clarification questions, I'm going to find out, oh, okay, they mean something more nuanced. They just didn't say it very well. I am happy to help them make their argument more clearly so that I can then respond to it more clearly.
I think that's the difference in our experiences is how often they really don't understand the biology. And when you dig into it, that really is where the problem is. So the philosophy is important and we need to clarify with people and make sure that we're understanding them correctly. But actually, my myths presentation is partly based on this. My first myth that I address is that we don't know when life begins. And I have a whole section explaining the difference between philosophy and biology. And the reason I put that in there is so I could be very, very clear that that's not what I'm talking about in this myth. In this myth, I'm talking about people using biology to misconstrue biological facts to support the pro-choice case. Right. It's actually, in fact, really quick, it's actually not even always the lay pro-choice person's fault because major voices on their side perpetuate lies about biology in order to shore up the pro-choice case. So they'll obfuscate on when life begins. They'll say embryos don't have hearts. They'll say the heartbeat is a propaganda from our side. You know, they'll misconstrue fetal pain arguments. There's all sorts of biology they will lie about specifically. And then the people who trust them will parrot that And it really is a misunderstanding of biology. But again, I also think you're right that a lot of times it's just vague wording and they are talking about a right to refuse.
Yeah.
My only point is that the genuine, actual biological miseducation is pretty common. So
Yeah, I think this is one of those points where it's kind of the double-edged nature of how we approach dialogue at ERI. Is I think a lot of these arguments might actually be as bad as they seem.
The pro-choice arguments?
And that's not just the bad biology arguments. I think this is the philosophy 101 crowd too. I don't think philosophy 101 is as meaningful an introduction to like, oh, you're a philosopher now. You think philosophically. It's largely pretentious. Like,
sure.
And full disclosure, I never took philosophy 101. I just did ethics later on. Well past undergrad. So I just had to deal with them in political theory. But like, you know, for the philosophy crowd, they're parroting someone else's argument because it's like, oh, this is a good slam dunk against those dumb pro-lifers. Mm-hmm. They don't understand what they think any more than the person who's like, yeah, the fetus isn't a human or whatever.
Right.
The way that we approach it, though, because we're trying to lead people to understand their own views more clearly so that we can more clearly refute what they think and like give them the ability to think through something they haven't before and give them the ability to fully choose the pro-life position so that it's not just like, oh, well, you know, they out-debated me, but like they're not convincing me. Is we make a better pro-choice argument than they do a lot of the time. So we're like guiding them. We're hand-holding sometimes and like, is this really what you mean to say?
Right.
Or do you want to say this other thing that is way more intelligent or plausible? And they're like, oh yeah, I want to say that thing.
Right.
Like, and so I've had conversations where like I'm guiding them like through the steps of the argument that they're trying to make. And, you know, I'm like, it happened where I was talking about bodily rights, going on the bodily autonomy side. And I got to thalidomide too. And the guy was visibly uncomfortable, but he wasn't like, I could see that he wasn't quite ready. He was just struggling. But he knew he was stuck in this dark alley that was thalidomide too. And so I'm like, okay, well, here's another way you can make your argument. Let's talk about personhood. And so I guide him over to personhood, and we're going through the pro-choice case for personhood and the equal rights argument. And the guy ended up taking one of our brochures with him. So like sometimes I think, you know, it's a good thing that we're doing where we're making the argument that's better. But the original argument, or you know what the people on TikTok are saying, considering some of the videos I've seen from the influencers on TikTok, they're actually really bad arguments, and that they're as bad as they seem. But you know, one of our jobs at ERI is to help pro-choice people make better arguments about abortion, which is not the thing that I say when I'm talking to pro-life people. But it's so that we can convince pro-choice people that we haven't like played a sleight of hand trick. We've raised you to the pro-choice mountaintop. This is as good as it gets, and it still doesn't work.
Yeah. I want to respond to a certain pro-lifer who is listening to this that is like, why would you help pro-choice people make better arguments? I know we've talked about this before, so I'm going to do this quickly, but it just like, this just sounds so weird to a lot of like, slam dunk, man. Like, hey, you've got the opportunity. Like, come on. Like, bring it home, close the deal, like that kind of thing. And first of all, it is here's how significant it is. Andrew's story a minute ago about the person taking our brochure with them. He wasn't taking a brochure about like, hey, here's what ERI does. He was taking our outreach brochure, which includes very, very graphic pictures of aborted children, both in the first and second trimester. And so that was a significant thing that he took the thing and wanted to keep looking at that and reading the arguments that were in that. But here's just one reason why to do that. And I've done this on planes with pro-choice people. I've got a very specific memory of having like several hours with a pro-choice person who was struggling and failing to make a bodily autonomy argument. And I chose to help him. I offered him like, I think maybe this is what you mean. And he's like, yes, he totally grabbed onto that. And I had people literally like after I told that story, why would you do that? And it's like, here's why. Because I have an opportunity. I know I've got 2 more hours before we land in LA. I've got time to deal with this like problem this like hole that I've dug myself. And if I don't right now, I don't know that he's going to get the opportunity to hear the better pro-life responses to those things later. And what I don't want to do is like slam dunk and mic drop and get him even be like, okay, I guess maybe pro-life is right because I was responding easily to his lame arguments. But then like he researches it and then he finds the violinist or whatever. He's like, oh, that's what I should have said. I'm still pro-choice. Like, no, I've got my chance. I want to respond to the best pro-choice arguments that he might ever be able to find right there. And at the same time, show him that I'm intellectually honest enough to help him make a better pro-choice argument. And that's going to make them more intrigued by, well, why am I pro-life if I can make a better pro-choice argument than this person can? Like, and I still ended up on the pro-life side. Gee, there must be a reason why. Like, those things are all happening when we help pro-choice people make better arguments.
Okay, so we're talking about pro-life people who strawman bodily autonomy, right? We think that's really annoying, but I think there's also this other related subset of difficult pro-life people, and sometimes it overlaps and sometimes it doesn't. So if a pro-life person is straw-manning bodily autonomy, they might be doing that really innocently, but they also might be doing that in a way that inherently makes it sound like they think all pro-choice people are stupid.
Yeah.
And that's this whole nother section, really, of pro-life people who come across in everything that they say, whether it's to other pro-life people or it's directly to pro-choice people, like they think there are no good pro-choice arguments, and anyone who is pro-choice is just obviously an idiot. Right. And they haven't thought about this at all. There couldn't possibly be any good reasons to be pro-choice.
I'm sure Monica's dealt with this before.
Oh, yeah. I think we all have. I mean, it's more likely to happen when you see a lot of genuinely bad pro-choice arguments and get confused and think that's all there is. I bet it happens in our group more than yours for that reason. Actually, just this morning on Twitter, one of my favorite followers on Twitter, I won't say who, tends to have very good arguments and be very funny. But he made a comment about how he really is getting to the point where he just thinks that they're just all pro-choice arguments are just terrible ad hoc rationalizations. It was like, to be fair, that might be because we're on Twitter, you know, like,
right.
Because I don't think he even has even a Facebook, and the venue makes a big difference.
Yeah.
And he agreed. He was like, yeah, that could be it. But if you are in social circles or social media circles where you see a lot of really bad bumper sticker arguments too often, it's easy to start to genuinely believe that's all there. It's the opposite of what I think happens with you guys, where you see better arguments so often, you actually think they're the more common ones. And not clear to me that that's true, but at least you know they exist.
Right.
So.
Yeah, I definitely get this a lot, even at talks. Like, I feel like sometimes there's this subsection of pro-lifers, they bristle a little bit at, like, when I'm talking about, like, so let's take philosophy seriously and let's think about the best arguments that exist, like all that. And they're just like, it's just so simple. It's either killing a life or it's not killing a life. Like, why? Like, don't make it so complicated. Like and it's just like, no, there are interesting pro-choice arguments. This isn't as simple as you think, both philosophically and emotionally, by the way. And so, like, I want to help us take up, go up a rung on the intellectual ladder. And there's just a lot of pro-lifers who are just like, what you're doing is stupid. Like, what are you doing? Like, why are you? It's like, this is like, I must be so much smarter because I figured out that this is actually a really, really simple thing. It just comes down to this one question, basically, and it all just lines up. And so, how could anyone be pro-choice, like that kind of thing? Unless they're just like they're just so attached to their lifestyle that, like, that's the only reason that they're pro-choice. And it's like, nope. I've talked to more pro-choice people than you, and there are pro-choice people that have really interesting arguments and are coming from different places. They're not all this one thing. They don't fit into the box that you think that they all fit in.
Exactly. I think there's also the pro-life person who thinks that pro-choice people are stupid in their own head. And then there's the pro-life person who treats all pro-choice people like they're stupid.
Talk more about that. So how does that present when they're going to treat pro-choice people like they're all stupid?
I think it usually presents itself, quite frankly, in just not using any practical dialogue tips. Like, I'm not specifically saying, like, ERI's practical dialogue tips. Any practical dialogue tips. Like, I have given speeches or, like, talked to pro-life people about practical dialogue tips, and they say to me, why does that matter? because pro-choice people can't think through things logically. They just can't.
Oh, wow.
And so it doesn't really matter for you to use these tips. You should just not even bother. And they like openly seem to treat pro-choice people like they think they're stupid. And from a pragmatic level, well, I don't think most pro-choice people are stupid. I think that treating them like they are, even if the one you happen to be talking to right now actually is making a completely absurd argument, treating them like you think their argument is stupid is not persuasive at all.
Well, and then you have to ask, so why are you even having the conversation then? What's the point? If you're not trying to persuade the person you're talking to or other people around, why are you putting the time and effort in? And I want to point out too, maybe a good way to get people to see why this is a problem is just think of the reverse, because pro-choicers treat us like we're all a monolith, often a very stupid or evil monolith all the time. And they'll assign motivations to us or intellectual inhibitions to us that don't apply. You know how that feels. And it doesn't persuade you. It doesn't make you more open to their side. It just makes you, angry and more resistant. So we already know how that works because they do it to us all the time. Why do the same thing?
Seriously.
Yeah, I'm willing to concede for sake of argument. Let's assume that most, not even just pro-choice people, let's just assume most people are stupid. Most people are stupid for the sake of argument. Are you going to convince them of your position by telling them that you think they're stupid? It's just not going to happen. Even if you think they are, that's not how you're going to change their mind.
I think part of the problem here with a lot of the people we're talking about is their primary goal isn't to persuade. Like we talk about, well, that's not persuasive. Yeah. They don't necessarily care about being persuasive. They might have some other goal in mind. Like a lot of times I'll see people talk about how the main thing is to courageously and boldly proclaim truth.
Right.
And they might have a religious reason for that or otherwise, but they're more focused on making sure that they don't shy away from hard truths than they are about being persuasive. Obviously, you could do both, but their focus is a different thing. So even when you talk about, is that persuasive? How can we be persuasive? It might be kind of assuming too much because a lot of people don't care about that. There's also this whole idea of, does shaming people work? Not just in the abortion debate, like, there's many political topics now where the primary reaction is, if you argue XYZ, we won't argue with you. We will just shame you as a bad person until you are quiet about it. And I think that I think there are some pro-lifers who think that's the best way to approach certain pro-choice arguments. They don't care about persuading. They just want them to stop giving the argument, Yeah. So, which is, I guess, a whole other problem. But
I think it's true, Monica, I really like what you said, but I think it's true that you can do both, that you can try to be persuasive and also be like, I'm going to make sure I'm always proclaiming the truth. But I will just say that typically in my experience, the person who literally says, I'm just here to proclaim truth, man, tends to be very unpersuasive. And it must be nice to be able to just walk away from any outreach you do feeling amazing because all you have to do to have succeeded is to have proclaimed truth. Like, I'm like really racking my head after a dialogue. Like, what could I have done better? Is there a way that I could have treated this person better or made them feel more comfortable or drop their defenses more? Or should I have responded to their arguments differently? Like, I'm thinking about all that stuff. It's not just about proclaiming truth to me. I want to actually make a difference, not just a statement. Like, it's so frustrating. And the last type that we want to talk about sounds kind of similar, but I think this is a different type, is the people who are like, all the women who have abortions are super evil. You know, that it's not that they're just stupid, they're evil. These people are going to hell. Everyone knows that if they're pregnant, that this is a baby inside them and that they are deliberately killing that baby.
That is just ignorance. This kind of is similar to when we were talking about acting like pregnancy is not that hard. To believe that everyone even knows that they're pregnant, much less knows that the nature of what they're I have been pro-life my entire life, passionately so, but long before I had children. Okay. I had two experiences that really brought home for me how not simple this is on an emotional, psychological level. The first one was when I had a pregnancy scare before I was ready to be pregnant. And scare is not the right word. I wasn't planning on it, but if it happened, I wouldn't have really been sad, And when I found out I wasn't pregnant, I was actually super sad. And it was a very bizarre thing to have such a strong emotional reaction to an entity that never actually existed. So I feel like that's a complicated thing. I felt like I was grieving and I hadn't been pregnant, right?
Sure.
That was confusing and a weird emotional experience. And then the flip side, the first time I was pregnant, when we planned to be pregnant and wanted to have kids immediately, I was surprised, especially in the first trimester, how not emotional I felt about it at all. I mostly just felt sick and exhausted.
Yeah.
And I was thinking a lot about how, again, I planned this pregnancy with my husband. It's something I've wanted for a long time. But on an emotional level right now, I don't feel in love or filled with motherly instinct or anything. And in fact, it almost, especially since it was my first pregnancy, it's almost like, am I really pregnant? I don't know. I just feel really tired. And the only visceral physical interaction you have is mostly very negative. You know, it's like we were talking about before with how difficult pregnancy is. It's so easy for me to imagine that if I was pregnant, but in a condition where I needed to not be pregnant,
right,
terrible relationship, or I'm not done with school, or whatever the normal reasons are that people talk about, first of all, it'd be very easy to convince myself I wasn't pregnant. I have tried to predict whether I've successfully gotten pregnant many times and been totally incorrect in both directions, right? Even after having gone through it. It's easy to think you are and realize you're just psyching yourself out. I think you're not, and the same. So it would be easy to convince myself I'm not pregnant and be in denial and stall. It would also be easy, even if I was pregnant, if I was scared or upset or there were bad conditions, to convince myself that it's not a human that counts yet. I wouldn't even say the word human. You can't feel anything. It's not a visceral, obvious thing. And I have studied biology formally, right? And I'm pro-life. And it was very easy for me in my first pregnancy. I thought about it a lot. And I was like, I can totally understand how women would easily believe that if they get an abortion, they're not aborting, a child.
Right.
They're aborting a potential. Because it all it feels like is exhaustion and nausea. And so for someone to say everyone knows, I just find that to be, I don't know how you could believe that. And I say that as someone who is pro-life and who has studied biology and who wanted all my pregnancies. It's still not that obvious. I find it when people say that, and to be frank, and I'm not trying to make this a sexist thing, but especially when men say it.
I was going with you. It's okay.
Yeah.
I don't want to hear a pro-choice or a pro-life man. I don't want to hear any man tell me what all women know when they go through pregnancy.
Yeah.
Just stop. You could be very intelligent, very empathetic, and have a lot of people who've talked to you about it, but you have not done it. It's a very bizarre experience.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's my rant.
Yeah. I mean, we had a recent commenter that I think you told me about who was like,
We did.
Yep. So what you're the one who saw it. Why don't you tell us the story? Because they were reacting to Andrew, right?
Yes. So this was, I assume that this particular commenter fell in the abolitionist camp. They were responding to the piece that Andrew did about the abolitionist SBC resolution.
Okay.
And in their comment, they claimed that women are twerking as they're leaving the abortion clinic in celebration of their abortion. And therefore, that is proof that they know they are killing babies. And not only that, but they are celebrating the killing of the babies. Now, my experience on TikTok, here we go again, back to TikTok. I feel like that's just been my anthem of this. There are pro-choice people who celebrate their abortions on social media.
Sure.
I don't think that means that they believe that they are killing a baby. For example, I just saw a pro-choice TikTok yesterday of a woman outside of Planned Parenthood doing a dance with like the caption, "Just dropped my kid off." And that comes across very, very like flippant about abortion.
Right.
Like, this is just, I know what I'm doing. And this is great. This is the greatest thing ever.
Yeah.
I think that those people are doing it largely to push back against pro-lifers.
Yes.
Because pro-lifers are talking about, this is a baby, this is your child, how could you do that?
Right.
And so she's not saying, this woman who made this video, I believe this is my child,
right,
and I just killed them, and isn't that awesome?
Right.
That's not what they're saying. They're saying, ha, you pro-life person, you're saying this is my child? Well, guess what I just did to this person you're saying is my child.
They're trying to get under the pro-lifer's skin.
Exactly.
This is the same person who
why would you even assume any of that's true anyway? When people do really edgy stuff like that and pro-lifers point to it as proof of anything, You don't even know she got an abortion. You don't even know she's ever been pregnant. She's posting to TikTok.
Yes. I acknowledge there are pro-choice people who do things that might make it look like they're really, really evil in what they're doing, and they know, and they're just, haha, I'm killing children. There are pro-choice people that are doing things that might look like that, but that means absolutely nothing about the actual women who are having abortions.
I mean, I've had pro-choice people come at an outrage where if I'm doing outrage with like Justice for All, for example, and there's like an 18-foot tall, there are graphic abortion victim photography, behind me, and they'll be like, oh, that looks like spaghetti. Or like they'll say like these kind of like obnoxious things.
Yeah, the whole thing is designed to get your outrage. It's the whole point.
Right.
It's trolling in real life. I don't know how that's not really obvious.
I think there might be, here are the people that maybe aren't trolling, is they are upset that, 40 plus years past Roe, that there is still this like cultural, like, abortion is still stigmatized, and they want to destigmatize it. And so joking around about it or talking about it, there are certainly, I think like Sarah Silverman or some female comedian has literally said, I do jokes about abortion because like why don't people talk about this more? This is no big deal. Like that kind of thing.
Sure.
So I know that exists, but I think most people are just trying to get under the pro-lifers' skin. And, Jacob is sidewalk counseled a whole lot. And he was like, most people are not dancing the rate out of the abortion clinic. First of all, they're in too much pain if they've had a surgical abortion. And secondly, it's just not where most of them are at. A lot of them are having a really, really hard day. And so let's empathize with them. And that works a lot better than just coming from this place of all women are evil and they all know what this is like.
Well, also, I believe there are women who get abortions and feel great relief and even joy sometimes. I believe that happens. But even if that is their emotional reaction, it says nothing about what they believe about the nature of the entity they aborted.
Right.
If anything, to my mind, it suggests they definitely don't think it was a child, because that would be a weird emotional reaction if that's what you thought.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a really good point.
Now, I want to defend this group for a little bit.
Okay.
Just
fine.
Because there is a thing that pro-lifers do that is also a well-meaning but really annoying thing. It's not one of the things on our list, but where it's like, oh, but the baby is a victim, but the woman who gets the abortion is the second victim of an abortion, and it's like it borders on taking away women's moral agency, because it's just like, oh, well, they just don't know. And it's like, that might be true. But if you're making a major ethical decision, you have the obligation to figure it out. Like that's everyone's job.
Saying they just don't know isn't really accurate. What you really mean is they don't believe what you're saying. It's not that they just choose not to figure it out. It's that they actively don't think what you're saying is true.
I think in some cases, I think there are also cases where someone might not know and they might not want to know.
Yeah, I think that's true too.
Yeah.
Like there's a moment of panic or crisis, and it would be really great if this narrative was true, because it makes things a lot simpler. So let's just go with that.
Yeah. So like while the just all women clearly know and they're evil, which by the way is this weird like flip side of the coin from the all pro-choice people are stupid. It's like, well, either they're all stupid or they all have perfect understanding of what they're doing. You pick one. But there's an extent to which if we're like, if pro-lifers are well-meaning and they're like, it's actually women, they just don't know because of all the lies the culture told them. They just can't be expected to know. And there's some truth to that. And I've written about that. But at the same time, it's infantilizing to women to say, oh, well, they can't know. There are plenty of pro-life women who do know, and women who have gotten abortions who, for one reason or another, know now what they either didn't know or didn't want to know then. Like it's not.
Yeah, I don't think the argument is that they can't know either. I think it's just that they don't. It's not that they can't know. It's that they don't agree. I think that's a stronger version of the argument. So I think I don't think it applies to all women. I'm not going to go that far. I think you have a point that it's more layered than that. But the idea isn't I'm not going to think about this. I'm just going to do it. I think that does happen. But I think in this case, I think there are a lot of people out there. In fact, I think this is kind of the crux of the difference between pro-choice and pro-life people. It's not that pro-choice people are just completely ignorant of the argument that abortion kills a human. It's that they actively don't agree that that is true in a philosophical sense, not a biological one.
Right.
Sometimes a biological one. And so to my mind, when people say, oh, she doesn't know, I hear it as she actively doesn't believe that's what's happening. Especially with early term abortions. I don't think it really works for later term. That becomes very implausible to my mind.
Yeah.
Even if you didn't know you were pregnant, I think it becomes less plausible as the pregnancy goes on. But especially for early term, like what I was saying before, when you just have no interaction, it's hard to believe that there's anything there. Maybe if you study biology and maybe depending on how you feel, what you feel about embryos. But I take your point. I think it's more complicated. And I don't think that all women who get abortions are a monolith. In fact, when you were saying that's the opposite of all pro-choicers are stupid, it's also the opposite of all pro-life women are idiots.
Right.
And I don't like it when people say that either. Or self-hating, right? It's more complex than that. But
pro-life women are all tools of the patriarchy.
I'm just doing this to impress my husband, who is not a pro-life activist and wasn't involved at all until he met me. But okay. Yeah.
I mean, basically, any broad statement that is like, it's all this thing. Is going to be, if people are involved in what you're talking about, that is just going to be too simple. So I agree, all women who have had abortions are total victims is too simplistic. Just like all women know exactly what they're doing is way too simplistic. Like there is a spectrum of moral culpability, and women who have abortions fall all over this spectrum. I think it might be true that more than half of women who have abortions fall on the more innocent side of culpability because there was enough that they didn't know or intend or whatever. But certainly there are women all over that spectrum. And so it's complicated. The people are involved, so it's complicated.
I also think, and maybe this is kind of to your point, Andrew, I agree there's a spectrum. I agree with everything you just said. I think the pro-life movement is more likely to emphasize one end of the spectrum than the other, partly out of empathy and probably partly out of strategy. And I can see how that would be frustrating to people who want to have a very more blunt conversation about what it is that's happening here. And there's a lot of resistance to that. I think it's a tricky topic.
It's a good point. Okay. So we've talked about the 8 types. Let's kind of wrap up by just giving just kind of some thoughts on how do we reach these people? If for like the ERI secular pro-life fans are like, they're with us. They're on our page on what we want the pro-life movement to be. And then they see this obnoxious thing happening in a comment thread or in person. What should they do? Should they do nothing? Should they confront the person? How should they do it? I'm interested in your guys' thoughts.
I don't think it needs to be any different than your general rules for how you dialogue with pro-choice people. So if your general rules are, these practical dialogue tips to be persuasive and to try to reach someone, you do that. Or if your general rules are, is this a total waste of time? Then maybe you do that. I also think, and we were talking about this earlier, I really don't believe in pro-life infighting. In fact, I wonder, I'm a little bit even nervous about this episode because it's spending so much time focusing on pro-lifers. I do want us to be the best version we can be. But the enormity of the problem we are trying to solve requires so much more resources than we have to begin with.
Right.
And I don't want to siphon too much off arguing with other people. So like, for example, if consistent life people think that I'm not pro-life enough because I don't agree with XYZ topic, or if abolitionists think I'm not trying hard enough, I don't have time. Like, I'm going to try with whatever projects I'm trying to do that I think will help. I'm trying to keep my focus on those and not get too distracted. And so I'm conflicted between the issue of trying to make pro-lifers better in general, more persuasive in general, and get them out there and helping, versus if they're not on board, I have lots of other things I could be doing besides trying to persuade them. I don't know. I don't have the solution to that. I do think it's tricky. So for me, when we get weird or off-putting pro-life comments on our stuff, most of the time, unless it's egregious, if it rises to the level where I need to say, excuse me, no, and don't bring that here again. But below that, I usually don't even mess with it at all because it's taking away time I could be doing something hopefully more helpful.
Yeah, but again, imagine the person asking this is not a full-time pro-lifer like you who is running an entire nonprofit basically by yourself, and you literally don't have time for this.
Or perhaps the person, maybe it's their friend, maybe it's their spouse, maybe it's somebody they have an ongoing relationship with.
Yeah. Or it's like the pro-life mom who's like, I have an hour a day that I want to be actively pro-life while my baby's asleep. This is what I want to spend that hour doing. And so I'm online. And if I see people talking about abortion, I want to jump in. Right. And I'm here. I have time. And I just saw this really obnoxious thing happen. Should I confront it or not? Like, should pro-lifers ever confront that kind of thing? Or is it all infighting and unhelpful?
I think there's a context for sure where you should do it. We talked about the one where if it's so egregious, you need to, just for the sake of clarity, be like, we're not okay with this.
Right.
And then the other rules will be, again, I think similar to how you feel about when you talk to pro-choice people. Like, how many other people will get to see this conversation as an example? How polite is this person being where I think they might be open to what I have to say? How easy is it to address their, are they making a single comment with a single claim that I can talk about? Or is it like 8 different points in 2 sentences? There's a lot of factors into how effective it would be. But if you are going to address them, I don't see any reason you would use different dialogue tips than you'd use for anything else. I
agree. No, I agree with that. We should still be asking clarification questions, and we should, I think like in my mind, if I was going to do it for whatever reason, I think I just want to kind of like to say like, what if pro-choice people were doing this to you? What if pro-choice people were acting this way? Like, that wouldn't convince you to become pro-choice. Like, probably it would just be annoying to you. And so maybe let's think about like, we're on the same team. Like, I want us to be as effective as possible because I really think there are minds out there that can be changed.
Oh, yeah.
If the person that they confront, that they're dealing with, is like a reasonable, kind, gracious, thoughtful pro-lifer. I mean, Secular Pro-Life has an amazing blog post. I think you've done this multiple times, but like, I always think about one that I saw that's like several years old. There's like, you guys asked, like, if you used to be pro-choice and now you're pro-life, tell us why. And then you compiled all these categories. And there were even people that are like, I changed my mind because of internet debates, which was interesting to me because I kind of used to think like no one changes their mind on the internet. Well, at least a few of them do. And
their blog would not exist if it wasn't for internet debate.
Right. Right. So so for me, like, it's like, I just want to like help them like get better. I'm not going to spend very much of my time doing it, but at the same time, this is an area where like ERI and Secular Pro-Life is a little bit different in our focus. Where like ERI has always been like, how can we help pro-life people to be more effective?
Yeah, that's a big part of your work.
It's a big part of our work, and it's complicated. And probably one of the more common internal conversations we have is what things should we say out loud and what things should we not? Like, and it's complicated. Yep. And there are some times that we've probably said more than we should have. And there are probably some times that we didn't say things that it would have been totally fine to say and we were too worried. Like, it's really complicated, especially when we're dealing with other like pro-life organizations and not just like individual people.
Well, then I think it comes down to how open they are, because ERI, your main audience are people who want to be better and they're asking you for advice. But the list we're talking about, we're usually talking about people who weren't coming to you for that reason. And some of them might be interested. I think some of the things we're talking about, people do innocently. And if you push back a little bit, they'll stop. It depends on how open they are to begin with. Like you said, the AHA kid who was really polite, like that was probably much more worth your time than a lot of random commenters on the internet.
I totally agree. Like, I'm not going to spend very much time with a closed-minded pro-life or pro-choice person. Like, it's a waste of time unless it's for other people who are watching. I totally agree with that. Sometimes you're not going to know if they're open-minded. And I know, I mean, I've told this story before, but there is a guy who changed completely his style of doing pro-life stuff because I sent him a snarky tweet. Like, I had a bad day this was before ERI, okay, to be fair. But I got some tweet from some pro-life where there's like, all pro-choice arguments are lies. They're all just like, all their arguments they're deceptive, they're ploys, like this kind of thing. And then I just respond. I clearly was having a bad day because I snarkily responded, tell me exactly how Judith Jarvis Thompson's violinist argument is based on lies and deceptions. I'll wait, like that kind of thing. And then
you even said I'll wait. Wow.
I don't think, no, I didn't say I'll wait. I'm saying that's like the tone, the attitude that I had, basically. And he never responded. It was over. Like, and I never thought about that tweet again for years and years. And it would have been, let's see, probably 7-something years later before we started ERI. I'm at the Students for Life conference, and this middle-aged white guy comes up to me and says, "You've changed my life. Because of this snarky tweet that you sent me a long time, I did this thing. I didn't remember it all. He had to like show me like a screenshot or something. He was like, look, see this snarky thing? I was like, wow, that was really snarky for me. That's unusual. I must have been having a bad day. But he's like, yeah, but like I deactivated my entire Pro-Choice Lies Twitter account after that tweet. And I saw the error of my ways. And now I work all the time with Teresa from Secular Pro-Life. And I do like I'm white Catholic guy. And I work all the time with her. And I love it. And like, he's completely changed, and he did not seem open-minded. So, like, there are going to be cases where you can reform that. He's probably more the exception than the rule. Mm-hmm. So I agree. Don't spend a ton of time on it. But man, I'm just thinking about all those pro-choice people who could become pro-life if they engaged with a better pro-life argument coming from a more kind, gracious pro-life person.
I was just going to say, maybe it's kind of the 80-20 rule where maybe it's worth it a lot of times to give one quick comment, quick overview, like, I don't really agree for these reasons, da-da-da. Don't get into a long debate. But if that person is persistent, and we've all seen this, pro-choice and pro-life alike, where they just decide that your group is like their thing.
Yes.
And they're just going to be around for a while.
We have a few in common, actually.
We have a few in common. I've had some that are for years, very consistent. You'll have plenty of additional opportunities to kind of poke here and there. You never know.
Yeah. And if you give that really quick response, you can often tell in their response to you, are they open or not?
Right.
Yeah.
And at that point, you can decide, are you going to keep on going or not?
Mm-hmm. Sometimes we actually I think it depends on it getting lucky almost sometimes. Like, you know, there are times where one person on ERI will respond one way, like will respond to what they're saying, rather than how they're saying it. And then, you know, sometimes like I'm generally the abrasive person. Like if you like, I don't do comments. I'm the kind of the opposite where if something is really bad, I will break my strict, I don't care what people write on the internet policy. And I will deal with the person. And I'm way more flexible if it's private. If it's, someone posts something on Facebook, I don't care. If you email me, you'll get a response. Generally speaking, I'm also bad at emails. But like, I pushed back on the tone. I'm just like of someone and just said, this isn't coming across the way you think it's coming across. And it was just like night and day. And sometimes people just need a little bit of like a push, and you don't think that it's that category. Like you might think that they're like this, like a much tougher person. Like, there are certain really tough people that we have in common that I'm thinking of, just beaming the name. And
it's so hard to tell online, right? For the people we know, I know people that I know personally in person, and then I see them online, and sometimes their personas are so different in both directions. I have a friend of ours who's volunteered for us for years that I've only known online for like 10 years, like a really long time. And I just met her in person in the last year, totally expecting her to be this really like sarcastic, aggressive. And she's just so calm and sweet. And I'm like, this is not what I thought at all. And she's like, well, I'm very blunt. I just want to get to the point online, but in person, you would never guess it. And then you have the opposite where online, they're actually really, really like polite and calm. And then you meet them in person and they're actually very sarcastic. They're just like filtering it all out the whole time. Yeah, I can think of one or two. Those ones are even more where you're like, wow, you're doing a really good job online. I had no idea. Yeah, it could go either way. So so to your point, Andrew, somebody could come off as super snarky online. And this doesn't go with my perspective at all, because if they do, I'm like, whatever, moving on all the time. But it's possible they don't even mean to, or if you were talking to them in person, it would be very, very different, and they think they're coming off a different way. It's always possible.
Yeah.
Maybe not the ones you've talked to for years.
Fair enough. Fair enough. So your story, Josh, and this whole conversation just about snark is raising this question for me that I feel like a lot of people listening may be asking themselves, which is, we at ERI have always taught that you shouldn't really treat pro-choice people with a lot of snark. Maybe sometimes it could be appropriate if they're doing that and you have a lot of rapport or whatever, but is it ever okay to treat a difficult pro-life person with more snark than you would give a pro-choice person out of wanting to, I don't know, impress the pro-choice people that are going to see this comment, like get them more on your side, or to really jar a pro-life person out of that behavior? Is that ever okay? Is the kind of tweet that you sent years ago before ERI, I know you don't love it now, but could something like that ever be appropriate? Should we treat pro-life people with more snark?
Generally speaking, I think not. I definitely am a lot more tempted to treat pro-lifers with snark than pro-choice people. That's always been a thing for me. It's just like, and for me, this is a biblical example, so I'm sorry, but this is like the example that I give people a lot in my head. But it's just like, look, Jesus, if he existed and all that, he gave the obnoxious Pharisees a lot harder time than he gave, the woman to the well, the woman caught in adultery, things like that. And I'm just like, I am a lot more bothered when pro-lifers just act like jerks than if a pro-choice person acts like a jerk. Like, fine, but it's like, don't make my team look way worse by acting obnoxious. So I'm certainly more tempted to be snarky, and I'm probably snarkier in my head with pro-life people than pro-choice people. We did a podcast a while back with Dang Pro-Life Memes on snark, and we were not really on the same page with him. Like, we're good friends with him, but he's definitely snarkier than we are. But the thing that I have to admit that I don't want to admit as Captain ERI is that some people are persuaded by snark more than our style of dialogue. Like, that's just true.
Mm-hmm. That is so true. We've talked about this before. I don't know if I agree that you should treat pro-lifers differently than pro-choicers, but in general, I do think, and it's very difficult to tell when, and I'm not an expert, but there are times and places where you need to be a little snarky. I know people who have told me overtly that if they're in a debate and the other person is constantly very, very polite and very, very chill, no matter how much they push, they lose a little bit of respect for them because they feel like they're kind of a doormat. It depends on the personality you're talking to. There are definitely a brand of people, I'm related to some of them, where if you never push back, they're not gonna be impressed. They're kind of waiting to see if you'll push back a little bit. Like how committed are you? They just have a different interpretation of those things. I do think that's harder to do online. Like, there's a place for it. And I'm definitely a little sarcastic on Twitter and stuff, but I don't think it should be different for pro-lifers than pro-choicers. But for both categories, there's going to be a time where it is appropriate to kind of shove back a little bit harder, I think.
So I definitely think there are some people that will be convinced by snark. And what I struggle with is knowing when it would be kind of safe to use it. Because, like, Monica is my favorite snarky pro-lifer in existence. I'm going to link to 2 of her speeches that are kind of snarky, but I like them. And I like that thing that Monica brings to the pro-life movement. But it's like, I'm like in my head, like, okay, I could be snarky here. I have a snarky line in my head with this pro-choice person. I've got some rapport, but it feels like a high risk, high reward play. And I typically don't play that one. So, Monica, have you figured out when to use snark?
No. I try not to most of the time. I'm more likely to if I've decided that the person I'm talking to is not the point and the audience is. And even then, I try not to hit it too hard because I think if you hit it too hard, you just sound defensive. Just like a little taste is fine. And it also depends on the venue. Like, my speeches are going to be way snarkier because they're to pro-life audiences. And my goal there is emboldening and encouraging people that are pro-life. But I have had some of my speeches sent by friends to their pro-choice friends for the content. And I regretted it because the demeanor ruined it, So it depends on your audience, depends on what you're trying to do. And I don't have a hard and fast rule.
What have you done processing the thought of, like, if you're too snarky in a speech to pro-lifers, like, not only might you embolden them, but you might actually kind of make them want to be more snarky, and maybe they're not ready or wise enough to like use that snark well out in the wild. Have you processed that, thought about that?
I don't worry about that too much because the speeches I've done have been, I'm specifically thinking about speeches at rallies and marches where most of the speech's tenor is very somber and often very, very reflective, which there's a place for. And I'm just trying to like vary it up a little bit. So like for the Dobbs oral arguments, there were like 30 speeches or more, very short speeches. And most of them were really just like heartfelt and talking about your experiences in a very somber way. And then there were just one or two, including mine, that were very yelly. I'm just trying to like wake you up a little bit. I'm not even thinking about, will they hear mine and then go yell at people? I just am trying to, I want you to see that you can have the attitude and be pro-life. It doesn't always have to be this really somber thing, even though I do think it's a very serious issue.
Yeah.
I also am doing speeches for people who bothered to show up, sometimes in the snow. And I just want them to know that they're appreciated. They're really putting this effort in. So that's a very specific kind of audience. The one I regretted was when I was giving my MITS presentation for the first time in Berkeley, which is not the same kind of audience or content at all. And I had purposefully intended and practiced it to be very dispassionate and just here's the information. Yeah. But it was an all pro-life audience, and they were responding to me in a way that I was there. Brought out kind of like, we're on the same page, and like, this is pretty stupid, isn't it? And then it kind of messed up because I knew we were going to record it. I knew it was going to be on YouTube, and all kinds of people are going to see it besides just pro-life people. It's designed for people that aren't already pro-life. Anyway, so I regretted that one, and that was one of the best recordings of it. And I'm like not very dispassionate at all. So I gave the presentation again a few months later, and there was a pro-choice person in the audience, and I knew that in advance. Yeah. Changed everything. Because I was thinking about that guy while I was giving it. He was more important to me than all the pro-life people because he's the only one that's not already persuaded. And my whole presentation was much more respectful. It's just hard to keep it all in mind all the time.
Yeah. That's really interesting. I have one case where I definitely think it's important for pro-lifers to actually confront a difficult pro-lifer is when sidewalk counseling. And we get this question all the time because of the sidewalk counseling masterclass. It's like, hey, I'm here at the clinic. This guy over here is a bullhorn and keeps on shouting Bible verses, literally shouting through a bullhorn, which is like, I don't know why you're doing both. They're like, you're doing both at a women. And it's like, oh, like they're going faster into the clinic. I'm watching them like walk faster into the clinic, and they're going to be involved in killing their baby. Like and it's making me less effective. I'm trying to reach out to them, but they don't want to come to me because this guy is over here. And like, what do we do?
Right.
And we have a whole module of the sidewalk counseling masterclass. I can't do all of it right now, but certainly we are encouraging people like try. It might not work. It very well might not work, but try. There's multiple techniques of confronting the person, trying to get them to lunch, trying to start at a very common groundy, like, hey, it's so great that you're out here. Think of all the people that are just on the couch or just like not doing anything. Kind of like what Monica was saying earlier, like at least you're here, you're doing something. And then like talking about like what strategies might be most effective, or maybe let's take turns and see what seems to work. And there are ways that we, recommend if you need to that are more confrontational than that. But like those are cases where like sidewalk counselors can make a huge difference in front of abortion clinics. And unfortunately, the bullhorn types tend to make the sidewalk counselors a lot less effective, even though they're perfectly satisfied because they're proclaiming truth all day. It's like they're like, we're fine, everything's fine. It's like, no, we're trying to save lives here, and you're making that difficult. So I do think it's worth it. But I will admit, it won't always work. And we are still thinking about like more techniques and things to have people try there, because it is easily the most common question we've gotten since we published the sidewalk counseling masterclasses. What do we deal with the difficult or alternative sidewalk counselors that are out here, or protesters or whatever? Yeah, that's what we called it.
The goth ones.
We were trying the alt pro-lifers. Yeah, we're just trying to come up with the most charitable label for it, and then we call them alternative sidewalk counselors. And so, yeah, that would be a case where I think it's worth trying. But I think start probably at the least confrontational level and then ratchet it up if you have to.
So before we wrap up this podcast, I think there's one last obvious question that a lot of maybe pro-life people who are listening to this might be thinking, which is, are we, by doing this podcast, engaging in one of the very things that we're saying difficult pro-lifers do? In other words, infighting and or becoming purity test pro-lifers ourselves, people that are calling out other pro-life people and saying, you're not doing this in the correct way or the best way.
Right.
And so are we becoming difficult pro-lifers by doing this?
I mean, certainly AHA considers me a difficult pro-lifer. I mean, they've got whole podcasts talking about that. I don't think this is infighting unless people are using the term infighting way too broadly. Like if infighting to you is like anytime any pro-life person expresses any kind of disagreement with any other pro-lifer, that's instantly infighting and bad and all that. I just don't agree with that. That's not, this is not my view. I want the movement to get better. I think the more complicated, like when we're thinking internally about like what kinds of things that are directed at the pro-life movement that we might want to say to try to help the pro-life movement get better. Like when should we say things and when should we not? The more complicated ones are like, what if it's like a pro-life leader or another pro-life organization that is doing these things? Like we don't want to call that out.
Sure.
We basically never do.
Focusing
but then
on a specific individual.
Right. But what's awkward, and we have had, and I'm certainly not going to name them, but we have had a specific group a little bothered by how much we're even talking about just ineffective things that pro-lifers do, because they're like, we do a lot of those things. And it's just like, and it's frustrating for them that we're like even talking about it.
Even without us calling out other groups, other groups feel called out because people see their strategies. We say that strategy is bad, even without saying. And then they've got people
going to them and being like, Josh Brown doesn't think that you ought to do things like that, or like that kind of thing, which is admittedly quite annoying. And so we try to be really wise about that. We don't want to come across like we're like anti the rest of the movement. I don't want us to come across like we're like competing with other pro-life groups. We're trying to take them all down or something like that. It's definitely not what we want to do. I don't want to spend all of my time talking about bad pro-life habits or whatever. I think we ought to spend some of our time doing it because there's some of the pro-life movement that's open to doing things differently. And so like, when I step in front of a young pro-life audience, and I say we've had 5,000 conversations and we've learned a lot of things from them about both what to do and what not to do. A lot of them are like at the edge of their seat. They're like, tell me the things. I want to know the things. I'm excited. Like, I'm just like open-minded. I'm cool. They're not bothered by it. It tends to be older pro-lifers that have been doing some of the things that I'm saying maybe are not the most effective, but they've been doing those things for 20 years and really like doing those things. And they don't, they kind of take umbrage with us doing that. So those are some of my thoughts. What about you guys?
Well, I think that infighting, I very much sympathize with being worried about focusing too much on infighting. I even felt a little bit conflicted about doing this podcast for that reason. But I think infighting would be more if we were listing these types of people and then arguing for all the reasons why they should stop.
Yeah.
But what we're really talking more about is the third party pro-lifers who see this and how do you respond and how do you handle it? So we're speaking to an audience that is asking. They're asking, what do you think? What should we do?
Right.
And there are going to be people on that list that also haven't thought about it, and maybe they'll hear it and be like, yeah, maybe I won't do it that way anymore. Infighting to me would be if we put this out there and then we get a lot of pushback and then we do another one and then we go back and forth and we start spending all this time just on this thing.
Right.
I do think there's a place like the 80-20 rule. I think there's a place where you could just say, hey, real quick, I don't know about this. And then people can agree with you or not, and you move on. Even saying I never do that. We do that sometimes. Sometimes we'll have a post that says, like, we've had a couple posts where I'll be like, everyone, just so you know, I'm not going to ban people for being pro-choice. Like, I want them to be here because echo chambers make you weak.
Right.
And so that's sort of me calling people out. But I'll just say it once, let people agree or disagree, and move on. I'm not going to, like, spend a ton of time on it. Or the 9 months of inconvenience post that I was talking about. I'll say it once. Here's my thing. Agree or not, move on. So I think infighting implies sort of a sustained effort. Right. And it also implies, like you were saying, especially if you're focusing on like a specific individual or group and fighting with them, as opposed to just these general ideas of how we think this could be better. I also want to say again, one more time, I don't think any of us are saying that the 8 people we listed aren't really pro-life.
Yes.
I think it's very important to me to emphasize that, because the whole "you're not pro-life if" thing,
Right.
most of the time when people say that, I don't think it applies. And I really do appreciate anybody who cares enough to speak on it, to try to do something, even if it's not what I would do. Like, you care enough that you're out there trying to figure out something, that's already a good start.
Right.
I it's not just a soundbite. I have a lot of affection for people who are at least putting themselves out there. So anyway, those are my thoughts.
Yeah. I think just because something is negative doesn't make it infighting. So Emily, picking on you for a second here, you do music lessons, right?
I do teach lessons.
Okay. So what would happen if you just told your students nice things all the time?
They would never improve.
Exactly.
Yep.
And so part of our job, and someone might complain like, we never asked you to do this. Well, there are people who do ask us to do this.
Yeah.
And it's an important thing to do, but part of our job is finding ways to improve that people don't necessarily want to hear, ways that are hard or painful or sounds negative. And again, like I said at the beginning of this, I have applied these to myself. It is good medicine. It tastes bitter in the mouth, but it's good when it goes down. And I'm significantly more effective now because of that. And I'm not speaking truth any less. And I, don't prioritize results over duty. I'm lean more like duty focused than results oriented anyway. But at the same time, results matter because lives are at stake.
Yeah.
And part of my duty is to do what I can to save lives. So if someone wants to label that infighting, I think that's unfair, but also like, this is an important thing. It has to happen. Otherwise you just kind of get flabby as a movement.
Well, it would be weird for the person who thinks that this is infighting to call us out for it, because then that would be infighting too. So
that is very true.
So you're just gonna have to be just be frustrated and quiet about it, I guess, because we're never supposed to say anything.
The other thing that makes this really different is, rather than telling people you're not pro-life enough and you should stop doing this,
right,
we're saying, thank you for doing what you're doing and trying and getting up off the couch, like I was saying. We think you should maybe improve on some things, but like, this doesn't stop you from being pro-life. We don't think you're less pro-life because you engage in these things.
Yep.
Like, when I teach a student, if I'm going to use Andrew's music lesson analogy, and I'm going to tell them nice things, and I'm also going to tell them things that they should improve on, you will never, ever, ever hear me say to one of my students, you can't sing. You should just give up
You're
taking
not a
music
real
lessons.
singer.
You're not a real singer. Why are
Sounds
you
so
even
much
trying?
sadder in that context.
And that is, I think, sometimes what some types of maybe purity test pro-life people might do is that you're not a real pro-lifer. You should just stop doing this entirely. And that's not what we're saying.
Right.
We're saying maybe there's some ways we can improve.
Yeah.
And so we're all on the same team. Let's try to do this better together.
Right. And if an individual isn't responsive to that, then move on. Like, then they're not interested. Fine. Then we can focus on other things. I am so glad that, Monica, you were able to join us for this. It was really good having you on. This is also Andrew's first podcast. Sort of. He did a live stream with us. We did the big live stream on Dobbs. So it was great finally having Andrew on the podcast. I think we'll be having him on more often in the future as well. No one is going to have any idea the kind of technical difficulties we have had to deal with. This has been about 3.5 hours of trying to record this.
Folks. It has been a day.
Thank you guys so much for doing this. I think this is going to be really helpful for a lot of people. And I appreciate you. And Monica, you are definitely going to be back on this podcast, and I can't wait.
Hopefully not on Wi-Fi next time.
Yeah, hopefully not on Wi-Fi. Let's have you maybe here. Great talking to you guys.